The morning of June 19, 1944 found Lieutenant Commander Saburo Watanabe of the Imperial Japanese Navy standing on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Zuikaku, watching the gray waters of the Philippine Sea stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The veteran pilot had flown combat missions from this same carrier deck since the attack on Pearl Harbor 30 months earlier, but the tactical situation facing the Japanese mobile fleet on this humid tropical morning differed fundamentally from anything he had experienced during the early victories of 1942. The combined fleet under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa carried the hopes of the Imperial Japanese Navy for one decisive battle that might restore Japanese naval supremacy in the Central Pacific. Watanabe commanded Air Group 601, flying the Mitsubishi A6M50 fighter that had dominated Pacific skies during the first year of the war. His flight record showed victories over American fighters at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean raids that had established Japanese air superiority across half the Pacific Ocean. The Zero fighter had achieved tactical success through superior maneuverability and range that enabled Japanese pilots to engage enemy aircraft under conditions favorable to Japanese tactical doctrine. Combat experience from December 1941 through mid-1942 had confirmed the effectiveness of Japanese aircraft design and pilot training against the fighter aircraft and tactical procedures employed by Allied air forces. Standing beside the island superstructure of Zuikaku, Watanabe studied intelligence reports describing the American naval force that Task Force 58 had assembled for the invasion of Saipan. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded 15 aircraft carriers and 7 battleships, supported by numerous cruisers and destroyers that represented the largest concentration of naval power ever assembled for Pacific operations. American shipbuilding capacity had produced these vessels in quantities that exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities by margins that Japanese naval planners had not anticipated when they planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. The strategic implications of American naval strength were becoming apparent to experienced Japanese officers, despite official optimism about the outcome of the approaching battle. The flight deck of Zuikaku displayed the aircraft that would carry the hopes of the Imperial Japanese Navy into what Admiral Ozawa had designated Operation Ego, the plan for decisive battle against American carrier forces in the Philippine Sea. Watanabe examined the Mitsubishi A6M50 fighters of his air group, noting modifications that had been implemented based on combat experience against American aircraft during the previous 2 years. Japanese aircraft designers had increased armor protection and improved engine performance, but these changes had compromised the maneuverability and range advantages that had made the Zero fighter effective during 1942. The tactical balance between Japanese and American fighter aircraft had shifted as American designers produced aircraft optimized for the specific combat conditions of Pacific theater operations. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nishizawa, the most successful fighter pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy with 87 confirmed victories, briefed Watanabe on the tactical characteristics of American fighter aircraft based on recent combat experience over the Marshall Islands and Truk. Nishizawa described the Grumman F-6F Hellcat as a fighter aircraft designed specifically to exploit the tactical weaknesses of Japanese aircraft and pilot training. The F-6F Hellcat carried 650 caliber machine guns with sufficient ammunition capacity for sustained combat, while its armor protection enabled pilots to survive damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft. American tactical doctrine emphasized high-speed diving attacks that negated the maneuverability advantages of Japanese fighters, followed by rapid disengagement before Japanese pilots could respond effectively. The morning briefing aboard Zuikaku included intelligence estimates of American carrier aircraft strength based on photographic reconnaissance and radio intercept operations. Japanese intelligence officers calculated that Task Force 58 carried approximately 900 aircraft, including more than 400 F-6F Hellcat fighters that represented the most advanced carrier-based fighter aircraft in service with any navy. American industrial capacity had enabled production of these aircraft in quantities that exceeded Japanese fighter production by ratios approaching 4-1. The numerical superiority of American forces would be compounded by tactical advantages derived from radar-directed fighter interception and coordinated attacks by multiple carrier air groups. Watanabe understood that the tactical situation facing Japanese carrier aviation differed fundamentally from the conditions that had enabled Japanese success during 1942. American radar technology had evolved from primitive early warning systems to sophisticated fighter direction capabilities that enabled coordinated interception of incoming aircraft at distances exceeding 100 kilometers from the carrier task forces. Japanese aircraft approaching American naval formations would face fighter opposition organized and directed by radar operators who could vector interceptors to optimal attack positions before Japanese pilots became aware of their presence. The tactical surprise that had been essential to Japanese success during the early phases of the war would no longer be available against American forces equipped with advanced radar systems. Chief Petty Officer Kenji Okabe, a veteran pilot who had flown combat missions since the China incident in 1937, described the evolution of American fighter tactics based on his observations during recent engagements over the Central Pacific. American pilots had abandoned the individual combat techniques that Japanese pilots had exploited during 1942, adopting coordinated attacks by multiple aircraft that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities through superior numbers and firepower. F-6F Hellcat pilots operated in pairs or 4 aircraft divisions that provided mutual support while exploiting the speed and diving performance advantages of their aircraft. Japanese pilots trained for individual combat found themselves facing coordinated attacks that negated their superior maneuvering skills. The strategic context of Operation Ego reflected the deteriorating position of the Imperial Japanese Navy following a series of tactical defeats that had eroded Japanese carrier aviation capabilities. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers during the Battle of Midway had eliminated the most experienced pilots and aircraft maintenance crews in the Imperial Japanese Navy, while subsequent battles at Guadalcanal, the Eastern Solomons, and the Santa Cruz Islands had further reduced Japanese carrier aviation strength. American forces had gained tactical experience while Japanese capabilities declined, creating conditions that favored American victory in any decisive engagement between carrier forces. Admiral Ozawa deployed the Japanese mobile fleet in 3 task groups designed to maximize the effectiveness of Japanese aircraft while minimizing exposure to American counterattacks. The 1st Carrier Division under Admiral Obayashi included the fleet carriers Taiho and Shokaku, while the 2nd Carrier Division under Admiral Joshima operated Junyo, Hyo, and Ryuho. The 3rd Carrier Division, commanded by Admiral Ozawa himself, included Zuikaku and the light carriers Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuho. This deployment enabled Japanese forces to launch coordinated attacks while maintaining sufficient dispersion to complicate American targeting procedures. The tactical plan for Operation Ego emphasized the superior range of Japanese carrier aircraft compared to American aircraft operating from Task Force 58. Japanese planners calculated that Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters and Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers could attack American carriers from distances that would prevent effective American counterattacks against Japanese task groups. This tactical approach required precise coordination between multiple carrier air groups and accurate navigation over vast ocean areas without the radar navigation aids available to American forces. Japanese success would depend on pilot skills and tactical coordination that had deteriorated significantly since the early phases of the war. Watanabe received his final briefing from Admiral Ozawa at 0530 hours on June 19, as the Japanese mobile fleet prepared to launch the first strike against American carrier forces located approximately 300 kilometers to the east. The operation would involve coordinated attacks by 69 aircraft from the 1st Carrier Division, followed by additional strikes from the remaining carrier groups as tactical conditions permitted. Japanese intelligence estimates suggested that American combat air patrols would be limited by the operational radius of F-6F Hellcat fighters, creating opportunities for Japanese aircraft to penetrate American defensive formations and attack the carrier task groups. The launch operations aboard Zuikaku began at 0600 hours, as Japanese aircraft took off into the humid morning air of the Philippine Sea. Watanabe led 18 A-6M50 fighters that would provide escort for 27 Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers and 16 Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers attacking American carriers. The formation assembled over the Japanese task force before proceeding eastward toward the reported position of Task Force 58, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection by American radio intercept operations. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized surprise attacks that would achieve tactical objectives before American fighters could organize effective resistance. The flight toward the American task force provided Watanabe with his first indication that Japanese intelligence estimates had failed to account for the full extent of American radar capabilities. At a distance of approximately 150 kilometers from the American carriers, Japanese aircraft began encountering F-6F Hellcat fighters that had been vectored to intercept positions by radar operators aboard American ships. These encounters occurred at distances that exceeded the detection range of Japanese aircraft, suggesting radar performance that surpassed Japanese technical capabilities by significant margins. American fighter pilots demonstrated tactical coordination that indicated real-time communication with shipboard control centers. The initial contact between Japanese attack aircraft and American F-6F Hellcat fighters occurred at 1036 hours, when Watanabe observed 4 American fighters attacking the leading elements of his bomber formation. The F-6F Hellcat aircraft approached from superior altitude in coordinated diving attacks that exploited the speed and firepower advantages of American aircraft design. Japanese pilots attempted to engage using traditional maneuvering tactics, but discovered that American pilots avoided prolonged combat by using superior speed to disengage before Japanese aircraft could achieve favorable attack positions. This tactical approach negated the maneuvering advantages that had made Japanese fighters effective during the early phases of the war. Chief Petty Officer Okabe, flying wing position in Watanabe's fighter section, transmitted radio observations describing American fighter performance that exceeded Japanese intelligence estimates of F-6F Hellcat capabilities. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat demonstrated climbing and diving performance that enabled American pilots to dictate the terms of engagement while avoiding situations that favored Japanese aircraft characteristics. American fighters carried sufficient ammunition to sustain combat for periods that exceeded Japanese capabilities, while their armor protection enabled survival of battle damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft. The tactical implications of these performance advantages were becoming apparent as the engagement developed. The systematic nature of American fighter tactics became evident as additional F-6F Hellcat aircraft joined the engagement in coordinated attacks that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. American pilots operated in disciplined formations that provided mutual support while maximizing the effectiveness of their numerical superiority. Japanese aircraft found themselves isolated and outnumbered as American fighters executed coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The training and discipline of American pilots had evolved significantly since 1942, when individual Japanese pilots had been able to exploit superior aircraft performance and tactical skills against less experienced opponents. Watanabe realized that Japanese attack aircraft were facing fighter opposition that had been organized and coordinated by radar systems whose capabilities exceeded anything available to Japanese forces. American combat air patrols had been positioned to intercept Japanese aircraft at optimal distances from the carrier task forces, while additional fighters were being vectored to engagement areas based on real-time tracking of Japanese aircraft movements. The tactical advantage of surprise that had been essential to Japanese success during 1942 had been negated by American technological capabilities that enabled comprehensive surveillance of airspace surrounding Task Force 58. The destruction of Japanese bomber aircraft began as F-6F Hellcat fighters penetrated the defensive formations maintained by Japanese Zero fighter escorts. American pilots concentrated their attacks on the less maneuverable bomber aircraft while avoiding prolonged engagement with Japanese fighters, using superior speed and climbing performance to maintain tactical initiative throughout the engagement. Japanese pilots discovered that their escort fighters could not provide effective protection against American attacks that exploited performance advantages and numerical superiority. The tactical coordination of American fighter operations suggested training and doctrine that had been specifically developed to counter Japanese aircraft and tactics. Lieutenant Nishizawa, despite his extensive combat experience and record of victories against American aircraft, found himself unable to engage F-6F Hellcat fighters effectively using traditional Japanese tactics. American pilots avoided the close-range maneuvering combat that had favored Japanese fighters, instead conducting high-speed attacks from favorable positions before disengaging rapidly to avoid counterattack. The tactical discipline of American pilots prevented Japanese fighters from exploiting their superior maneuverability, while American numerical superiority enabled coordinated attacks that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. The evolution of American fighter tactics represented a fundamental shift in Pacific air combat that negated many advantages that Japanese pilots had enjoyed during 1942. The systematic destruction of Japanese attack aircraft continued as F-6F Hellcat fighters demonstrated firepower superiority that enabled rapid engagement resolution. Each American fighter carried 650 caliber machine guns with sufficient ammunition for sustained combat, compared to Japanese fighters that mounted only two 20mm cannon and two 77mm machine guns with limited ammunition capacity. American pilots could engage multiple targets during individual sorties, while Japanese pilots were constrained by ammunition limitations that reduced their effectiveness in prolonged combat. The industrial capacity that enabled American ammunition production provided tactical advantages that Japanese forces could not match. Watanabe observed the systematic destruction of his bomber formation as American fighters penetrated Japanese defensive formations and engaged individual aircraft with overwhelming firepower. The Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers and Nakajima B-6N torpedo bombers that constituted the striking power of Japanese carrier aviation proved vulnerable to F-6F Hellcat attacks despite escort protection provided by A-6M0 fighters. American pilots demonstrated tactical skills and aircraft performance that enabled them to destroy Japanese bombers while avoiding effective counterattack by Japanese escort fighters. The tactical balance between American and Japanese carrier aviation had shifted decisively in favor of American forces. The radio communications between American fighters indicated coordination and control capabilities that exceeded Japanese expectations of American technological development. F-6F Hellcat pilots received real-time tactical information from shipboard radar operators who provided vectors to optimal attack positions and warnings about Japanese fighter movements. This integration of radar technology with fighter operations enabled American forces to maintain tactical superiority throughout the engagement, while Japanese pilots operated without comparable technological support. The systematic nature of American fighter direction suggested technological capabilities that represented fundamental advances in naval aviation warfare. Chief Petty Officer Okabe transmitted his final radio message as F-6F Hellcat fighters overwhelmed his aircraft with concentrated firepower that penetrated the armor protection of his A-6M0 fighter. His observations described American fighter performance that exceeded Japanese aircraft capabilities in every category except maneuverability, while American numerical superiority negated even that advantage. The tactical evolution of Pacific air combat had reached a point where Japanese aircraft and pilot training were inadequate against American forces equipped with superior technology and numerical strength. The implications of this tactical reality extended far beyond the immediate engagement in the Philippine Sea. The few Japanese aircraft that penetrated American fighter defenses discovered additional layers of protection surrounding Task Force 58 that further reduced the effectiveness of Japanese attack operations. American destroyer picket ships positioned at distances exceeding 20 kilometers from the main carrier formations provided early warning and additional anti-aircraft firepower that supplemented the defensive capabilities of the carrier task groups themselves. Japanese aircraft approaching American carriers faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships, whose radar-directed gun systems provided accuracy that exceeded Japanese expectations of American defensive capabilities. Watanabe attempted to lead the surviving aircraft of his formation toward the American carriers, but discovered that F-6F Hellcat fighters continued to engage Japanese aircraft throughout their approach to the target area. American pilots maintained pressure on Japanese formations through repeated attacks that prevented effective navigation and target identification by Japanese bomber pilots. The tactical persistence of American fighter operations reflected training and doctrine that emphasized sustained engagement rather than the brief individual combats that had characterized earlier phases of Pacific air warfare. Japanese pilots found themselves unable to disengage from combat long enough to conduct effective bombing attacks against American ships. The anti-aircraft defenses of Task Force 58 represented technological capabilities that exceeded Japanese estimates of American defensive firepower. American ships mounted radar-directed 5-inch gun systems that could engage aircraft at ranges exceeding 10 kilometers, while smaller automatic weapons provided close-range protection that created zones of defensive fire around individual vessels. Japanese aircraft approaching American carriers faced defensive firepower that had been coordinated through radar systems and fire control computers whose accuracy exceeded anything available to Japanese naval forces. The technological advantages that enabled American defensive superiority reflected industrial capabilities that Japanese forces could not match. The systematic failure of Japanese attack operations during the morning of June 19 demonstrated the extent to which American technological and tactical capabilities had evolved since the early phases of the Pacific War. Japanese aircraft that had achieved tactical success against American forces during 1942 proved inadequate against F-6F Hellcat fighters operating under radar direction with numerical superiority and superior firepower. The tactical assumptions underlying Japanese naval aviation doctrine had been invalidated by American technological development and industrial capacity that enabled production of aircraft and equipment in quantities that exceeded Japanese capabilities by enormous margins. Lieutenant Nishizawa survived the initial engagement but observed the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation capabilities that represented decades of training and tactical development. His radio transmissions described combat conditions that differed fundamentally from anything experienced during previous engagements with American forces. F-6F Hellcat fighters demonstrated performance characteristics and tactical capabilities that exceeded Japanese aircraft by margins that could not be compensated through pilot skill or tactical innovation. The systematic nature of American fighter operations indicated training and doctrine that had been specifically developed to exploit Japanese tactical weaknesses while maximizing American technological advantages. The second wave of Japanese attacks launched from the remaining carriers of Admiral Ozawa's task force encountered identical tactical conditions, with F-6F Hellcat fighters intercepting Japanese aircraft at distances that prevented effective penetration of American defensive formations. American radar capabilities enabled detection and tracking of Japanese aircraft from the moment they departed their carriers, while American numerical superiority provided sufficient fighters to maintain continuous combat air patrols over vast ocean areas. Japanese aircraft approaching Task Force 58 faced coordinated opposition that had been organized and directed by technological capabilities that Japanese forces could not match or counter. Watanabe, flying one of the few Japanese aircraft to return from the morning attacks, reported to Admiral Ozawa that Japanese carrier aviation had encountered American fighter opposition whose capabilities exceeded all previous intelligence estimates. F-6F Hellcat performance, American numerical superiority, and radar-directed tactical coordination had combined to create combat conditions that favored American forces by margins that made Japanese victory impossible under existing tactical circumstances. The technological and numerical advantages enjoyed by American forces represented strategic capabilities that reflected fundamental differences in industrial capacity and technological development between the two nations. The afternoon attacks launched by Japanese carrier forces achieved equally limited results against American defenses that had been strengthened by the arrival of additional F-6F Hellcat fighters from carriers that had not been engaged during the morning operations. American pilots demonstrated tactical flexibility that enabled rapid adaptation to Japanese attack procedures, while American radar systems provided real-time intelligence about Japanese aircraft movements that enabled optimal deployment of defensive fighter formations. Japanese carrier aviation was systematically destroyed by American forces whose technological and numerical advantages had reached levels that made effective Japanese resistance impossible. Chief Petty Officer Okabe, who had survived combat operations since the China incident, observed during his final mission that American fighter capabilities represented a fundamental transformation in Pacific air warfare that negated every tactical advantage that had enabled Japanese success during 1942. F-6F Hellcat aircraft performance, American pilot training, and radar-directed tactical coordination had created combat conditions where Japanese aircraft and tactics were obsolete. The systematic destruction of Japanese carrier aviation during the Battle of the Philippine Sea marked the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective force in Pacific operations. The tactical lessons of June 19, 1944 demonstrated that American industrial capacity and technological development had produced military capabilities that exceeded Japanese forces by margins that could not be overcome through tactical innovation or pilot skill. F-6F Hellcat fighters represented aircraft design that had been optimized for Pacific combat conditions, while American radar systems enabled tactical coordination that provided decisive advantages over Japanese forces operating without comparable technological support. The Battle of the Philippine Sea established American naval aviation superiority that would persist throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet withdrew toward the Philippines after losing 3 aircraft carriers and approximately 400 aircraft during the 2-day engagement that Japanese pilots would remember as the most devastating defeat in the history of Japanese naval aviation. American technological superiority, numerical advantages, and tactical coordination had combined to produce results that exceeded even American expectations of F-6F Hellcat performance and radar-directed fighter operations. The systematic destruction of Japanese carrier aviation represented a strategic victory that eliminated Japanese naval aviation as a significant factor in Pacific theater operations. Watanabe survived the battle but never again flew combat missions from Japanese aircraft carriers, as the Imperial Japanese Navy lacked sufficient aircraft and trained pilots to conduct effective carrier operations following the Battle of the Philippine Sea. His experience during June 19, 1944 represented the moment when Japanese naval aviation encountered American technological and numerical capabilities that rendered traditional Japanese tactics obsolete. The F-6F Hellcat fighters and radar-directed tactical systems that destroyed Japanese carrier aviation would dominate Pacific skies throughout the remainder of the war, ensuring American naval supremacy in all subsequent operations. The morning of June 19, 1944 marked the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective force in Pacific operations, destroyed by American F-6F Hellcat fighters operating under radar direction with numerical superiority that overwhelmed Japanese defensive capabilities. The tactical evolution demonstrated during the Battle of the Philippine Sea established patterns of American technological and numerical superiority that would persist throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Japanese pilots who had dominated Pacific skies during 1942 discovered that American industrial capacity and technological development had produced military capabilities that exceeded Japanese forces by margins that made effective resistance impossible. The systematic destruction of Japanese carrier aviation during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot represented the culmination of American technological development and industrial production that had transformed the tactical balance in Pacific air warfare. F-6F Hellcat fighters and radar systems that enabled coordinated fighter operations provided American forces with capabilities that exceeded Japanese aircraft and tactics by enormous margins. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated that American forces had achieved technological and numerical superiority that would ensure victory in all subsequent engagements with Japanese naval aviation. Lieutenant Commander Watanabe's experience during the Battle of the Philippine Sea exemplified the broader challenge faced by Japanese forces throughout the later phases of the Pacific War. Traditional tactics and equipment that had enabled Japanese success during 1942 proved inadequate against American forces equipped with superior technology and overwhelming numerical strength. The F-6F Hellcat fighters that destroyed Japanese carrier aviation represented American industrial capabilities and technological development that Japanese forces could not match, ensuring American victory in the decisive naval engagement that eliminated Japanese carrier aviation as an effective force in Pacific operations. The legacy of June 19, 1944 extended far beyond the immediate tactical results achieved by American F-6F Hellcat fighters during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The systematic destruction of Japanese carrier aviation demonstrated American technological and industrial capabilities that would dominate Pacific operations throughout the remainder of the war. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the losses suffered during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, while American carrier forces continued to expand their capabilities through continued technological development and aircraft production that exceeded Japanese capacity by enormous margins. The tactical innovations demonstrated by American forces during the Battle of the Philippine Sea influenced naval aviation doctrine throughout the post-war period. Radar-directed fighter operations and coordinated attacks by multiple carrier air groups established patterns of naval warfare that became standard practice for modern carrier operations. F-6F Hellcat performance during the engagement validated American aircraft design principles that emphasized firepower, protection, and speed over the maneuverability that had characterized earlier fighter aircraft. The technological advantages demonstrated by American forces during the battle established American naval aviation superiority that persisted throughout the Cold War period. Watanabe reflected during the post-war period that the morning of June 19, 1944 marked not just the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation, but the demonstration of American technological capabilities that transformed the nature of naval warfare. F-6F Hellcat fighters and radar systems that enabled coordinated fighter operations represented industrial and technological achievements that exceeded Japanese capabilities by margins that made effective resistance impossible. The Battle of the Philippine Sea established American naval supremacy that would persist throughout the remainder of the 20th century, validated by technological superiority that reflected fundamental advantages in industrial capacity and technological development that Japanese forces could never match.